Hello my friends, today I'm going to be reviewing the Gigabyte nvidia GeForce RTX 5090 Gaming OC video card. Uh, the card is one of the better cards in NVIDIA's range. Basically, cards are defined by their series. So you look at the first two numbers, that makes it the 50 series, and then the 90 is where it sits in the stack. So the series here starts at 50-50, 50-60, 70-80, and then 90 is at the top of the stack. And they call it a gaming card, but it's perfectly good for productivity work as well. And the reason that I chose this card, if I just have a look at their other cards, it's not the most expensive one, ignoring silly ones that are made of gold or whatever, but it's pretty close to the top. And the reason is that the really, really expensive ones tend to be water cooled. And I didn't want the complexity of water cooling. I already have a water cooled CPU, a Threadripper 3960X, and I wasn't sure that I'd have space for another water cool fan cooler in my system. But more importantly, that water cooling tends to last for less time than air cooling. So here, see where these fans are, 3 fans here, and then they blow out of the side here, I believe. And with a water cooling, you have a cooling block here with tubes that come over it. Let me see if I can just find one just to show you. The point is that the water cooler, what it has is a block that goes on this, and then a water cooling pipes that pump cold water over the cooling block, and then they go off to a fan block where it's cooled elsewhere, and it's like a bunch of fins that cool it down. If I can find one, I'll drop an image in at this point. And the water tends to get kind of brackish, and it stops working much quicker than these air coolers. So I didn't want that complication. Also, they're a lot more complicated to install. With these, you simply put the card in and then you're ready to go. Now, I'm not really going to go into a lot of detail on this review with regard to the tech specs in a way that, say, somebody like Jay-Z or Linus or Steve at Gamers Nexus might, because it's not really relevant. But what I am going to do is review this card from the point of view of a 3D user. So this card is going to work fine with Poser, it's going to work fine with DAZ, it's going to work fine with Blender. Stick a pin in what I just said about DAZ because there are some caveats on that. Basically, the current version of DAZ doesn't work with it, kind of. But anyway, let's just talk about some of the specs for this card. So the base clock for the reference version of this card made by nvidia is 2017 megahertz, and the number of cores is 21,760. So you can think of cores as being like the number of pistons in a car, and the clock is how fast the pistons turn over. So this version of the card runs at 2550 megahertz. So as I said, it's the fastest one you could get without water cooling, although my demonstration there when I just searched kind of suggested otherwise, but it was at the time. And they all have 21,760 cores. So this is an upgrade for me over my 3090, which I bought 3 or 4 years ago. You might recall I reviewed it, and the 3090 had 10,496 cores, so this is over 100% more cores. The 3090 also had 82 ray trace cores, and this has 170, so just over 100% increase again. And the megahertz of the 3090 was 1395 compared to 2580 for this, so not quite twice as much there. But given the cores is a significant increase. You might suspect that overall it would be 100% faster, or even if you were looking at Moore's law, you might even expect more because this is 2 generations further on. But that's not the case. It's harder and harder to increase performance with each iteration, because there's only so small you can make silicon, and there's only so so fine the chips can be made, basically. Anyway, so how will this work with a 3D card? Well, basically there are two manufacturers, well, three if you count Intel, but kind of discount them for now, except at the low end. But at the high end, there's AMD and there's nvidia, and really nvidia is the only company that you should be considering for your graphics card. Here's the nvidia website, just comparing. And the reason for that is because nvidia has CUDA cores and Optix technology. So CUDA cores, as I mentioned, the card has cores which are discrete CPUs, if you like, or processing units on the graphics card. And what makes NVIDIA different to, say, a CPU? If you look at your CPU on your PC, you know, your i9, i11, whatever, that will have possibly 12 cores, probably 8 or even 6 cores, and each of those can do a unit of work up to maybe 5 gigahertz. But these cards have, as I mentioned earlier, 22,000 almost cores, and each of them is doing work. So imagine if you're rendering or if you're doing AI or whatever you might be doing, each of those cores is doing something. So it's a massive increase in workload. And what's special about NVIDIA compared to AMD is that NVIDIA Optix technology massively improves the speed at which those individual cores are working, 50%, 100% faster. So if you're looking for, I mean, you can still use AMD cards, but AMD don't use Optix, so that's a massive difference between them. So the way that your computer speaks to the card is through what's known as an API. The API is the kind of intermediary language, stands for an application programming interface, I believe, and or program interface. And on Poser, it can use OpenGL, that's for the display, and then it can use Optix or CUDA. If you're using an AMD card, it can use OpenCL, which is a kind of a more open standard to OpenGL. The good thing about OpenCL is it also lets your processor, your CPU, and your GPU work simultaneously, which you see also if you use DAZ Studio. DAZ Studio uses OpenCL as well. And on DAZ Studio, if I show you DAZ Studio here, we go into DAZ, and you'll see here in the hardware section of the engine, you will see here that it shows both things working simultaneously. And so I've got an Optix renderer here, and I've also got my CPU. Whereas if I compare Poser and I go into the render here, you get a choice of one or the other. Optix is the best, Ryzen Threadripper, even though it's a really, really good multi-core processor, orders of magnitude slower, and we'll demonstrate that when we look at some results later on. But on the CUDA drivers, you can only use one, but because Optix is so much faster, the fact that you get Optix on the NVIDIA cards blows away the benefits of OpenCL on DAZ Studio, for example. So let's just look at some tests. So I did a number of test renders. I did this native one, which you can't see here, natives. I did this one, which I called the office. I'll insert the renders at this point. Then I did one called the grandparent option, which is like your buying family. I did a bunch of stuff on DAZ Studio. I did one called let me have a look. The accounting, which is kind of a mafia boss speaking to people. I did one called Santa, and I did one called Karate Guy. So they were my benchmark. So let's just have a look at some of the results. So on the PC, on Poser, with the Office, I rendered it at 4K resolution, And just using the basic CUDA drivers without Optix, it took 7 minutes 51 seconds to render. But with Optix, this is on the 3090, 4 minutes 31. But now look at this on the 5090, half that speed. So what's that? That's, yeah, just a little bit over half the speed, but a significant saving from 3090 to 5090. Now, if we look at the natives one, another nearly 4K, not quite 4K, but it doesn't matter because the image complexity affects how quickly it renders anyway. And on this one, this was the only one that I managed to get the Threadripper to finish. You'll see I tried to do a Threadripper CPU render on the Office and it crashed after half an hour. So on this one, I got a Threadripper to render and it took 16 minutes to render. But when I did the CUDA, it was 3 minutes. When I did the Optix, 2 minutes. And when I did the 5090 version of Optix, 1 minute 10. So again, almost half as slow, or twice the speed if you like. And then the last one I did there was the grandparent option, which is the one with where they're buying grandparents. And Optix, the basic CUDA, that's without using the Optix driver, was 6 minutes dead. Then Optix 3 minutes 48. Now this one wasn't quite so much faster, 25.4% faster. It took 2 minutes 50. So that just goes to show that Optix is not uniform. Even on the 5090, the performance increase is not the same across every image. The amount of lights, the amount of textures, things like that are all going to make a difference. So the card is actually 32 gigs of memory compared to 24 on my 3090. Probably you've got a card that's 16 gigs or less. Most likely, if you're on a 1080, that's what, 4, something like that. None of these renders took over 8 gigs of memory, of GPU memory, but yet there was a significant performance improvement on the first two over the second. Now, there was something very, very interesting that I saw when I was rendering, and that was that the first render of every set, the first thing it did, Poser had to load some kind of render kernels, which took 5 minutes. So I added 5 minutes to the render, but then the first full render was actually the fastest render. Once you took the kernel time out, the first render of every single set, I rendered 3 to get an average, and the first render of every single set was the fastest, and then they got progressively slower, and I'm pretty sure that that's down to a memory bleed in Poser. What that means is that it's not properly clearing the memory before rendering again. Now, you have this option in Poser to retain textures or to reload them, and if you retain the textures, in theory, where is it? I think it just maintains the textures in there. I can't find the option at the moment, but it keeps the textures in memory as long as you're on the same image. And in theory, that should make it quicker because it doesn't have to reload textures. But in actual fact, each successive render gets slower until eventually it just completely crashes. So that is a Poser memory bleed problem, in my opinion. So if you're iterating upon a design, it's always worth saving regularly, or better yet, have autosave if you're saving to an NVMe or an SSD card. So onto DAZ Studio now, and I had 3 images there, and here's my speed for the 3 images on DAZ Studio. So again, I was comparing the RTX now. Something very, very interesting happened here. The first image was a super low resolution, super low detail image, just a single guy. I'll put him up on the screen in a second. Karate guy, just a guy running on a blank background. On the 3090, it used both Optix and Threadripper, but it took 2 minutes 20 seconds to render, which is incredibly slow compared to Poser. You know, there's almost nothing going on. So you could write that off as being a first render, but then I did it on the 5090 and that jumped to 17 minutes, 12 seconds. And something very interesting happened there. It took 5 minutes to render the initial image to do the first 99%, and then a further 12 minutes 14 seconds to do the last 1%. So it's hitching at that last 1%. I don't know what DAZ is doing there. And what that highlighted to me is that there was a problem with the way that DAZ Studio 4.24, the one that you're most likely using, works with the 50 series cards. Because I know with the 30 and 40 series cards, it's fine. And I went away and researched it, and I discovered that if you want to use 50 series cards, you need to download the Studio 2025 beta. And you'll notice here an absolutely stellar improvement of speed from 2 minutes 20 seconds, and that's what, 120, 140 seconds, down to 5.7 seconds. So that is absolutely unbelievable. Now, that I don't even want to calculate what speed improvement that is in terms of percentage, but it's not maintained on the others, because on my Santa image, we got Studio 4.24. This image is, that should say Studio 25 here. Studio 2025. And Studio 2020, the initial image took 32 minutes. The initial one on the 5090, oh my goodness, this chart is badly designed. Sorry, guys. The initial one on Studio 4.25, I gave up at 2 hours. I thought it was just ridiculous for something that only took 32 minutes to render before. And then the 5090 on Studio 2025 was exactly 50% quicker, or half the speed of the one on the 3090. So that's a really good improvement there. And then on the accounting, I let that go all the way through on the 5090 using Studio 4.24, and it took exactly 2 hours to render. So that was over 100%, almost 300% longer than the 3090 took on Studio 4.24. But when I used the beta, and I will make a video on how to get this running, when I used the beta, that time then reduced to 17 minutes. So that's a third as long as it took to render on the 3090. So you'll see here we've got, hundreds of percent faster, a third as long to render, and half as long to render. So a really wide range of improvement performances on the on DAZ Studio, so long as you are using the 2025 beta. So now I went on to look at, I'll be honest, I completely forgot to do anything on Blender, and I wasn't going to go back and install a 3090 to do that. So I just downloaded some benchmarks on MiXR, and here's their Blender render times. They've got the 3090 scored 5272 on the synthetic test, and the 5090 scored 3 times as much at 15,090. So that appears to be 300% improvement. Again, that will vary according to what you're seeing, is because the amount of lighting and whether you're ray tracing or doing a biased render will all affect the ray tracing speed on Blender. If you're using another program such as 3D Studio or even Unreal, or whatever other 3D program you're using, Maya or Lightwave, for example, your performance will vary according to which drivers you're using, apart from anything else. So I also did some tests in testy program that I've forgotten here. So this is 3D Mark. Now this is a gaming benchmark, but it's a useful kind of idea just to get some ideas. Most people don't use their PC GPU just for rendering. They usually use it for other things as well, and gaming is one of the common ones. So I'll just go through some of these. So we'll start with Nomad. This is a general gaming benchmark, but it's a good way to get a difference in performance. So this is just testing the general core performance, and you'll see here it's a number. What it does is it goes through an animated scene, and at the end of it you get a number that tells you how well it performed. And you see here it performed almost 300% faster. So the next one then is a DirectX Gaming, DirectX 11, which you'll be probably using if you're on Windows 10. And this one, not quite such a big improvement. On DirectX 12, the improvement was better, I believe. So this is what, very loosely, about 80% faster. And then Port Royal's an interesting one because it references the ray tracing engine, and you'll see here that this exceeded 100% faster. So that's really excellent. And then the last one is Solar Bay, which is more of a general purpose renderer, but it's good for, I believe they call it cross application rendering. And it will also give you the ray tracing performance of laptops. And again, this is, what's that, about 60-70% faster. So a good all-round performance improvement. I am more interested in how it improves my Poser renders than I am in some synthetic benchmark, to be honest. And I imagine that you will be as well, because what matters is how much faster it makes things. So you might argue, well, I'm on a 1080 or a 2080 or, even a 2050 or a 970, whatever card you're using. I mean, if you're using anything younger than a 20 series card, so just to remind you, the series are compared here. You've got a 10 series. Well, in fact, it goes beyond that 9876, but they're hundreds, not thousands. So what you have here is the series are prefaced by two numbers, 10 series. So that would be a 1050, 1060, 1070, 1080, 1090, then Super, TI, and I think there was something else. I can't remember what the other family is. And each series has multiple graphics cards which are better than this series before. So a 2080 is going to be better than a 1080, for example, and obviously was more recent. And in almost all cases, there were some anomalies with the 50 and 40 series, not necessarily much better than their predecessors. But the 10 series didn't have ray tracing. And if you didn't have ray tracing, there's no Optix engine. So anything earlier than 10 series, so 900 or 560 or whatever, they won't have ray tracing. So you're paying a 100% speed penalty just because they don't have ray tracing. So your entry level needs to be at least a 20 series. Okay, now obviously I've gone for 50, and I think I mentioned this in my other video. The reason is because I am convinced, well, persuaded, probably more than convinced, that the graphics card market is in a very dire situation, and you may not be able to buy new graphics cards for a long time. As I said in my other video, the 50 series is allegedly, nvidia are going to decrease the production of these by 40% due to the RAM shortage, and they both have are both affected by the growth of AI data centers, and all of the cards and RAM are being funneled to data centers. So if cards become in short supply, the price is going to go up. Now, let's be honest, £2,600, £2,500 was no giveaway. Ridiculous. I bought a Titan before COVID, maybe 2016, and that cost me £600, and I felt like a proper fool for spending that much. I must admit, I got good use of it, and then I got great use out of the 3090, which I bought during the COVID, and this card, I run on a display which is 5120 by 1440, which I think is ultra widescreen, mega super widescreen, and so that takes a lot of GPU processing to drive that screen properly. And because I play games, probably one of my favorites is Dying Light and Metro Exodus, and they both have ray trace engines, and it takes a lot of processing power to drive those screens with all of the effects on. And the higher the resolution, the more effort it takes to maintain a high frame rate. Nowadays, most people probably consider 100 frames per second to be the acceptable minimum frame rate for gaming. Anything slower than that, and the screen is not responsive as you turn the mouse. But obviously, when you're working on a scene in Poser, you might think to yourself, well, I've got a 1080. It only I don't need Optix. It only takes me an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours to render a scene. But here's the problem. It's not the time it takes to render your end scene. I remember back in the days when I was a nipper, that I used to render scenes that took a day or two. And nowadays, if it takes an hour, I really feel hard done by. But here's the problem. When you're building a scene, especially a complicated scene such as this one, which has got, well, actually, it's not fully in there. It didn't load it properly, but there's, maybe a dozen characters in there. Or that one with the natives, if I can find it. Where's the natives one gone? No, this one, which has got a bunch of natives, an animal over there, loads of plants. There's a lot going on here, and when you start building that scene, you'll be doing lots and lots and lots of test renders to see how the lighting looks, to see how the scene looks, to see how the figures look. Often you'll put a figure in and you won't know that fingers don't properly wrap around something until you rendered it a few times. And that's where the real cost of a graphics card comes in. It's not the end rendering. I used to hate the days when you had to spend days waiting for render, but I was prepared to do it so long as I got it right first time every time. Of course, back in the day, you could do area renders, and although you can still do an area render now, that's where you just render a small part of the screen. What you used to be able to do before Bondware fucked everything up was you used to be able to render a scene, and then you'd see a bit was wrong, and then you'd go into your scene and edit that scene, and that's where the OpenGL drivers come into it. And then you'd area render, you'd load up the previous render like I've done here, and then you just draw an area render over the bit that you changed, and it will just add it to the scene without having to render the whole thing. And so you could just render a bit there that only took you 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes compared to maybe, hours or a day to render the whole thing. But now they fucked that up. When you do an area render, it does this annoying little kind of dotted lines around it, so they ruined it. But even if you whatever card you have, you really ought to have at least a 20 series, because that's the first series that had the ray tracing engine, and with the ray tracing engine came Optix, and with Optix came orders of magnitude greater speed. But for me, I wanted to go to the very, very fastest card that I could afford, and what I'm hopefully doing is future-proofing myself. So when I bought my PC 3 or 4 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago during COVID, I bought a Threadripper, which seemed excessive at the time, and I also bought a 3090 during COVID. So wow, that's 5 years ago already. Wow, that's shocking. And obviously nvidia was price gouging for all they were worth even back then, and so I paid a huge amount for it. But what I did was I bought the most expensive PC that I could afford because I was trying to future-proof myself. And by that, I mean what I was trying to do was build a system that I'd still be using many years in the future rather than upgrading. In the old days, the upgrade cycle used to be every 3 years. The average user would buy a new PC every 3 years. But now that components cost more than a house on a Ferrari put together, that cycle has definitely hit a hiccup, and I think it's going to be a good thing, because what it's going to do is it's going to force software developers to optimize their programs. In the past, what they would do is they'd release a game, for example, and the game was horrifically optimized. It ran like dog shit, and they'd just say, oh, what you need to do, like what's that idiot? The guy who works for the people who made Borderlands, Randy Pitchford. What a twat that guy is. And his game is, so mediocre, not amazing graphics, and people were complaining that it didn't run smoothly even on a 5090, and no, on a decent GPU. And he said, well, this is a high performance game. You should have to buy a decent performance PC. And it's like, no, it's not the PC. It's that your game, you've just optimized it lazily. And what you're doing is shifting the burden off onto the players of that game to buy more hardware because your company wanted to save money optimizing, or perhaps because your company was incompetent and couldn't optimize. But now that hardware is so expensive, what they're going to do is start taking a hit on their future sales of software, be it 3D software or be it games, because they haven't optimized and their stuff doesn't work properly. And so, that's a good thing. So just to round off on this review, inverted commas, because I've wide-ranging rambling talks here. Am I happy that I bought this? Do I think it's a good purchase? Well, I think the price is absolutely scandalous, but it could be the best price that you could ever get this for. I'm convinced that nvidia wants to reposition the 5090 series, which offers, excuse me, I'm convinced that they want to reposition the 5090 series as a pro series, for the kind of people who really own Teslas and Ferraris and, £1 million houses. I don't think they want the average user to have this. I think they want to, like Armani clothes, they want, or Rolex watches, they want it to be perceived as a luxury product, so they can charge £5,000, $5,000, whatever, And I just wanted to get in ahead of that. So this is a couple of £100 more than it was a few months ago, but it's not excruciatingly painful to buy. It comes with a 3-year warranty, and you can upgrade it by registering for another year. Now, I did mention a couple of things about it before I give you my conclusion if I'm happy with it. It requires, I think it's let me have a look at the power requirements for it. Just a sec. Here you go, 520 watts TDP, which in theory is the peak power draw. Compare that to the 3090, which I can't find. Where's the 3090? 3090, which was 350 watts, so another 200 watts. But the thing is, if you have multiple hard drives and optical drive and an optical drive in your system, 1,000 watts is not going to hack it. So they say recommended 1,000 watts, but I think you should buy a 1,200 watt. Now, if you buy from Scan, they have most people buy with, and then they often do a power supply that comes with it for a little bit cheaper. But you're really going to want to buy a 1,200 watt power supply by a name brand, a platinum rated power supply ideally. Now, you might be thinking 500 watts, so what's electricity in the UK? 25 pence per watt, so 2 hours per 25 pence this card costs to run, I guess. But the thing is, the card doesn't run at that all the time. It's down to the workload you're giving it. So your electric bill will definitely go up by at least, if you use this, say, 12 hours a day, 10 hours a day, your electric bill is going to go up by £10 to £20 a month. But if you're in the market for this, perhaps that's not such a problem, but it might be a consideration. But it's if you did nothing but play games where it's caning it all the time, you're not going to need heating while this is running. Let me put it that way, because when this is running and my Threadripper, my desk is positively hot where it's heating it up from underneath. But that is a consideration, the power usage on it. So do I recommend it? If you have enough money that is not excruciatingly painful, or your time is money, so you're doing a lot of renders and you make money from it, uh, or you just want to give yourself the treat of a lifetime and somebody else is paying for it, you will definitely see performance improvement even over the 4090. I think, didn't that end that let me just find. Yeah, even there it was 30% improvement over the 4090. So you'll definitely notice the difference in terms of time. And the more complicated your scenes, the better. Now, 32 gigs of memory, it's arguable that you won't really hit that very often. You know, you could probably on Poser get how many figures? Probably 20 or 30 figures in memory there. Now, when you start to put that many figures in memory, the the speed of the device really matters. And on DAZ just handles memory like complete crap. So it doesn't matter how much memory you've got. It doesn't matter what processing speed DAZ is as likely to crash as not. You know, it's really unbearable. DAZ is horrifically optimized, whereas Poser, for all that Poser's out of date, and it does crash sometimes when it's rendering, but Poser is far more stable than DAZ Studio, and Poser handles multiple figures far more gracefully than DAZ Studio does. So although you might not often get, you know, I mean, how often do you do a scene that needs 20 figures? You know, generally you either have a scene that's got a crowd scene in the background, which you're not going to be able to render anyway, you know, like a boxing match or something like that where there's 50 or 100 people in the background. And even then, what you're probably going to do is you're going to arrange your character to minimize the number of figures that are visible, you know, or you're going to put in a photo background just so that you don't have to render it because it's going to be so slow. So the 32 gigs, you know, I struggle to see when you're going to need that. But if I ever hit a render where it needs that, I'll let you know. I'm more interested in the number of cores and the clock speed. That's where you're really going to notice a difference. And even for me, with my GPU, which is still very graceful playing games, a 3090 is, you know, 5 years old now, well, 6 if you count this 2026. But I think I bought it sort of late in the year, so 5 years old. Handles even high resolution games with aplomb. I'm not very sensitive to frame rate in games, but you know, when I render, it's cool. But now this card, I notice a visible difference in rendering. And I was talking about when you render, incidentally, I was saying that one of the problems is that you do a lot of iterative test renders. Of course, you can always turn the render quality down, which I probably would anyway. I would turn it, you know, if you're doing an Optix render, one of the ways to turn the render down here would be to choose an Optix fast render. And if you're rendering in Firefly, then you'd probably want to do an auto setting on draft that doesn't kick into ray tracing, maybe set here, just to get an idea of the geometry of the scene before you start moving up to ray tracing. Then when you do move up to ray tracing, move up to final, and then you go into manual settings, acquire from auto, so that picks up the settings I just set, and then just start turning some of these off so that it's not quite so quick. So you could even ray trace but have no subsurface, no indirect light, no irradiance caching, and it would still be nice and fast. I could even turn this shading rate down to 1 or 2. It would look rough, but it's only just it's only test renders to get an idea of the scene. So there's a lot of things you can do to make up your iterative renders faster. But at the end of the day, a really nice graphic card helps. So I love the card, hate the price, hate the price, just pure greed, but I am happy I bought it. So anyway, guys, I hope that you found that useful. I didn't really talk much about Blender because I don't use it an awful lot. I know that Cycles uses both Optix and OpenCL, which is in Blender as well as Blender has a version of Cycles. That's where Poser got it from for their Superfly engine. So there are different ways that you can optimize Blender to use the fastest elements of the cards you've got. And also with OpenCL, again, as I mentioned, you can have it use both Optix and your CPU, depending on how fast your CPU is. Sorry, I didn't have Blender ready. That was lazy of me. If you want to get 3D Mark to give it a test and compare, you can check it out on Steam. I think it's like £5 or £10, really cheap. The Blender render you can download for free. I'll put a link. And until then, guys, you have a fantastic week, and I will speak to you later.